Hello and welcome back to Reimagining Cyber. My name is Ben, and joining me today is Tyler Moffitt, the Senior Security Analyst at OpenText Cybersecurity. And Tyler, today we're talking about ransomware and milk, not a combination that I expected. Tell me, what's going on?
Yeah, I know it sounds strange, but I mean, this story is definitely worth discussing. I want to make sure everybody's abreast of the latest and greatest. But this one, when you talk about ransomware, a lot of the stories can become abstract fairly quickly. But another company was attacked, right? Systems were available, investigation is underway. Most people have heard, some version of a story hundreds of times, but this one is different because the consequence is very tangible, right? So if you're not familiar, depending on where you're at, Fairlife, they make milk. They're a very big brand here in the U.S. and you see them at grocery stores everywhere. They have a big selection of all the different types of milks or non-milks, whatever your dairy or dairy alternatives are. Most people are aware of them. They're owned by Coca-Cola, multi-billion-dollar company. Okay, and basically they were suspended. Their entire production line and operations across the United States were made unavailable. And so that's absolutely crazy. It's a really good example of how like a digital or cyber attack can interrupt a physical multi-billion-dollar business.
Wow. Now, let's start with what we actually know. What has Coca-Cola confirmed?
Right. So I think this news broke late last week, I think on July 16th or 17th. But Coca-Cola filed an 8K form with the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. And they said that Fairlife identified unauthorized access by a third party to a portion of its systems. And it was production-related systems in connection with the ransomware event. After detecting the incident, Coca-Cola basically activated its incident response teams and security protocols, right? And so outside advisors and cybersecurity experts were all brought in, law enforcement notified, you name it, right? And so the results are pretty significant, right? Fairlife was temporarily suspended production across the entirety of the United States. Its Canadian production operations were not affected, so I will call that out, and said, quality and safety has not been impacted. That is what, we can confirm from what Coca-Cola has disclosed. But there are several things we do not know anything about. So Coca-Cola has not publicly identified which ransomware group or how they gained access, how long they were present, whether any information or what information was stolen, if the systems were encrypted. I'm guessing that something had to be done to shut it down. Like some files were inaccessible to stop production to a halt. I'm guessing something like that was had. We don't know how much money they paid or didn't pay or what was even asked. The complete scope and impact are basically still being investigated right now. So we're going to know more. Maybe we'll do a follow-up. But, the consequence is pretty massive for full production line stop and halt of the entirety of the U.S. So interesting nonetheless.
Yeah, I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and guess that not all of our listeners au fait with the world of manufacturing. So how does ransomware actually stop milk from being produced?
So modern manufacturing depends far more on technology, no matter what you're seeing. Just for generic consumers and what they see in a factory, there are lots of physical processes involving, just thinking about this, filtration, bottling, packaging, sanitation, storage and shipping, like computer systems, they're responsible for all that. The scheduling, the monitoring, the documenting, the moving it through each different little conveyor belt in there. Those systems depend on other systems for production scheduling, temperature monitoring, quality control, all those things that we talked about, the shipping and tracking, all those operations. And we don't know which any of one of those systems were, impacted in Fairlife specifically. Coca-Cola has only described them as, quote, production-related systems, which is a massive, wide, broad term. Who knows what it could be? Could have been the entire thing. We don't know. But imagine trying to operate, when you cannot correctly identify the systems surrounding production, right? Can you confirm that correct production settings are being used? Did the sanitation process complete correctly? Like, can you accurately document quality control checks when this stuff is shut down? Like, Can you trace the product back to a particular batch? I mean, these are all big concerns, right? The last thing you want is a recall. We're seeing that with other things in the industry like lettuce, but it's an important thing to be able to coordinate production and available storage and distribution, and you have to have that chain, if that makes sense, intact and fully transparent. The machinery itself could still be physically capable of operating, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the company can safely or responsibly use it. That's where this impact of ransomware could have just maybe disrupted one or a couple stages, but it ultimately impacted everything. We don't really know, but that's where supply chain is really important in what we see. The distinction is really, really important, right? The issue is that once unauthorized access reaches production related systems, the organizations, they've got to determine exactly what was touched, where it was touched, can it still be trusted. I mean, all that stuff is really important, especially in food production. You can't just be like, we think it's probably fine. That's not acceptable. And everybody knows that.
Yeah, that the suspension of the production, it doesn't really tell us how badly those systems were damaged, I guess, does it?
Yeah, not necessarily. You're sort of left in the dark. A full shutdown doesn't automatically mean every system was encrypted or destroyed or interrupted, right? When authorized access is detected, responders may isolate symptoms, or they see a problem with one thing and then to start to disable accounts, disconnect network segments, take certain systems or applications offline, right? And those actions that they do in a precautionary measure, they're going to be disruptive, right? And they may prevent the attacker from continuing to move through the environment or compromise something else. They also need to preserve evidence and determine whether the attackers, what they had access to. Did they steal things? What credentials did they get? Additional tools, you name it, right? Or did they create a back door or another way back into the network? They got to make sure of all of those things. And so continuing production before answering those questions creates unnecessary risk. So it's a good look into it, right? A lot of people confuse the consequence of an attack with the quality of the response. And this is Coca-Cola we're talking about, right? So unauthorized access represents a massive security failure. And so stopping production afterwards was, probably the responsible safety and containment decision, I would think. And, similar to evacuating a building after discovering smoke or a fire alarm goes off, right? The evacuation is disruptive, but it doesn't mean that the disruption of the evacuation was a mistake. So temporarily stopping production likely, or I presume, have prevented a larger operational or safety problem.
Let's move on to ransomware then. People will still tend to think about ransomware as files being encrypted and, that message that comes in demanding Bitcoin. How accurate is that?
So, yeah, I mean, that is definitely the face of ransomware, and people assume it. Ransomware's been around now. We're coming up on 13 years. So 2013 of September is when we first saw the first crypto locker. And don't get me wrong, that still happens. A ransom note, something in your face, big obvious, send Bitcoin to this address, blah, blah, blah. But encryption is just really one way attackers create leverage now. The actual objective, especially with these big, large companies, is enough pressure that makes paying the ransom become attractive. And it's not necessarily just from the encryption. It's the operational downtime is enormous pressure, right? Especially when they go after manufacturing plants and stuff like that, right? If they encrypt an unimportant system, they have little leverage. If they interrupt manufacturing or healthcare or transportation or retail or some other critical business process, right? The financial consequences begin immediately, right? They lose production. Every hour systems become unavailable. They probably have a dollar amount that they know how much they're losing every hour they're offline, right? Especially raw materials or stuff like this that's perishable, and suppliers are requiring and continuing to deliver their inventory. So when they run out, they're like, where's the supply coming, right? And so they expect those shipments. And employees and contractors all still need to be paid and likely are contracted to. And so, again, adds to the dollar amount of being lost. And so calculating how much longer the business can tolerate the disruption is the big question, and what impacts their decision on like paying the ransom and get everything back up and running, or do they have adequate procedures in place and backups that they can bounce back without paying it? But then there's also another thing, the double extortion, right? They also steal data. Pretty much all major ransomware affiliate groups they do the double extortion, which is data exfiltration of important stuff, right? It's that second form of leverage. And, even if they're able to bounce back and not pay the ransom and be like, hey, screw you, we've got everything under control, we can bounce back later today or tomorrow. Now it's like damage to brand, reputation, crisis comms of the data, your employee information or customer information on a leak site. You don't want any of that, right? That's we don't know if that was what happened. Just want to clarify here, like Coca-Cola has not confirmed any data theft or exfiltration or leak sites. That's probably information to come in the coming months. But that's where ransomware is so complicated now, right? Restoring your system availability and getting it back up and running, it really only solves one part of the incident.
I just want to rewind a little bit to something you said at the beginning of this episode regarding Fairlife's Canadian production. You said it was apparently unaffected. Is there anything that organizations can learn from that? What's going on?
Yeah, I'm not sure why it was unaffected, other than the fact I'm guessing geological separation. They haven't explained why Canada remained operational. Could be separate, segmentation and just separate technology environment in general. That's my guess. Different infrastructure, different service providers, stronger, regional separation. It would be my guess. But we can't say which explanation is correct. And we've definitely seen examples where ransomware, because of the connectivity and interconnectivity of all these devices and Internet of Things, they have shut down multiple different factories in multiple different countries that are close to each other. I mean, Canada's right next to America, and they shut down all of production and all the plants in all of America. So some of those plants are going to be close to Canada. It is at least worth the pontification of, well, what happened in Canada? Why didn't it hit? But it gives us a useful way to discuss, failure domains, organizations in general, especially big ones, Coca-Cola companies, need to consider how much of the business can be affected by, one compromised environment. If every facility depends on the same identity platform, the same remote access tools and infrastructure, administration tools, production management systems, one intrusion can potentially become company-wide. Like if you're identical copy-paste the production of a factory into every single factory you have in the country or the world, then you got a problem. That could have been, different in Canada. I mean, maybe had different systems, and so their exploits or however they came in didn't work in the Canadian stuff. And that separation is important because it prevents that stuff, right? Not only doesn't mean that every facility needs to be like an isolated island. It just means, organizations still need that centralized management and visibility, but they should understand which dependencies could allow one incident to spread basically everywhere, right? So it's a useful exercise to ask, like, if one production facility is compromised, can the others continue operating, right? And so if the corporate identity system becomes unavailable, can plant operations still perform essential functions safely? And so, if corporate network must be isolated, what production processes stop? Can one facility be restored without reconnecting it to infrastructure? I mean, these are all great tabletop exercises that you would hope that they've planned for. And so whatever specific reason Canada remained operational, keeping part of the business running definitely helps a lot in significantly reducing the total impact of attack, because I'm sure Canada can help out and, supply some places that may have been impacted because of this.
Okay. Here's a solution then for Fairlife that I'm suggesting. Go totally nuclear, wipe the affected computers, restore the backups, and resume production. Why, Tyler, is that a bad idea?
Well, I mean, that's a good call out. I guess it's because, especially with sensitive production line like this with perishables, restoring technology in this environment isn't necessarily the same as like restoring the business process. You need to understand where the intrusion began, right? That's huge. If attackers were present for an extended period of time, you don't necessarily know what's compromised. And I know you want to do a full nuke, reload, renew. What if they've put, backdoors or malicious tours, unauthorized accounts? That's another thing too. How do they get in? Do they compromise identities? Because a lot of those work through password resets and stuff like that. Or it's the persistent mechanisms are growing for the criminals. And you also need a clean environment in which to perform the restoration. restoring clean data into an infrastructure the attacker still controls, they could potentially put the company back into a same position, right? We have seen this before where people think that they're ready to go full nuke and reload, and the attacker's right there again the next day, and that's a problem, you know? Um, so you might successfully restore a production application only to discover that identity services or databases or certificates or service accounts or whatever network connections dependent might still be unavailable. And so everything's got to be evaluated. You know, it's really tough, right? There are lots of things to worry about. Like, are the production configurations current? Are quality control records accurate? Can employees authenticate correctly? Can batches be tracked? I mean, there's so much stuff that you've got. I don't even know what I don't know. I'm just like guessing, if that makes sense. There's probably so many different things and minute processes that they've got to, that I have no doubt that this took them offline, and being able to switch back on is a lot tougher. And I'd love to interview if they would ever, you know, ask, hey, what was shut down? All these things you've got to do. But it's definitely tough. You know, I would say that's why asking an organization to have backups and able to nuke and reload, it's not enough, right? You know, they've got to reconnect all of the dependencies, validate that it's all working, resume business process, and it's all tough. You know, that complete sequence, it's got to be tested before there's an incident. So let's hope that their tabletop exercises, you know, really came in handy here.
Coca-Cola said it hasn't yet determined whether the incident would materially affect the company. What kind of consequences could emerge if the disruption continues?
Well, the loss of production itself, right? How much money did you lose by not producing when you had to shut all down the conveyor belts and you're not shipping out stuff? Did they have to throw away the batches that they'd already produced, or whatever? It's all perishable. These things that they're calculating right now, right? If the facilities are not operating, there's less product that's unavailable to ship and sell, right? Then you have the cost of bringing in all these cybersecurity experts, forensic investigators, legal counsel, recovery specialists, equipment vendors. I mean, and you know, they're all frantically working, running around with their head cut on fire, like working overtime. Yeah, there's the potential regulatory notification, the fact that we're known about it. People don't like hearing about breaches. There's stock impact. That's probably the biggest one we saw with like Marks and Spencer and Co-op, was like they lost like $250 million overnight just to people going, you were hit by a breach, you know, and it's tough, right? And milk and other raw materials, they're perishable, right? Packing and ingredients may continue arriving while production is stopped. And so if the warehouses potentially have limited capacity or have to, you know, move this stuff through production, there could be ingredients they have that expire. I don't know. If the interruption lasts long enough, right, shortages can move through the entire supply chain. So we really don't know where it is. And that's just talking about, you know, the damage to the goods that they have to move through. And then we talk about the regulatory notification, and there's the reputation. This is really, really big for them as well, right? You know, the damage to brand and recognition, and the stock price potentially. You know, the communication is important. The crisis comms are some of the toughest stuff, and I've been in those boardrooms to have to communicate that. The last thing you want is like false public perception about product safety, especially during this time. I'm sure you guys have heard what's going on in the USA with the lettuce production and things like that, and is difficult. You know, you gotta you don't want another separate crisis forming on top of the cyber attack itself.
Coca-Cola, they were fairly direct in describing this as ransomware. Is that notable, do you think?
Yeah, because I mean, if you're saying ransomware, probably a group. They very clearly left a note who they are. You know, companies use phrases like technology disruption or network incident or unauthorized activity during early stages of an investigation if they don't know what's going on. So the fact that they're not being vague and at least are telling us specifically it was a ransomware event means that, you know, they know who it was, have yet to disclose who it was. But I mean, obviously they've already acknowledged to us production related systems were involved and production had been suspended. So it's pretty significant, right? And that's good. You know, we obviously don't know the full scope, nature, impact. We don't know all that yet, but they gave us more than what usual vague disclosures get. So that's good, right? The disclosure obviously doesn't answer everything, but it gives investigators, customers, and business partners a meaningful understanding of the situation on, hey, ransomware. So they know it's big, and we'll probably learn that more as time goes on.
Okay, let's get to the learnings now. We'll start off with organizations and IT teams. What should they be taking away from this incident?
Well, I mean, it's tough because this is, Coca-Cola, big multi-billion-dollar company responsible for producing milk and milk protein-related drinks. This is just sort of generic stuff. We can only pontificate on things like that, but you have to identify the technology that actually keeps the business operating, right? Don't begin with just a list of servers and how expensive they are. Begin with the business process. That's the biggest thing, right? If this system disappears, what stops? What other applications, accounts, databases, whatever, what does it all depend upon, right? How long can the business operate without that, right? Who is the authority to declare it safe or cleaned after restoration? Second, organizations, you got to test your segmentation around critical environments. Definitely. Someone using a compromised corporate account to reach production-related systems, can one administrator basically manage both office systems and industrial environments? Are some of these remote management tools unnecessarily shared across facilities? This is all important stuff, like unusual authentication activity, remote access tools, service account misuse, lateral movement, attempts to disable security controls, access to all those systems an account doesn't normally use. I mean, these are all the attack paths that criminals use that you need visibility into, right? And so a lot of the times when you talk about these breaches, they'll find an indicator of compromise, right? Or an attack vector. And you have to sort of find out which one's the first one. How did they first come in? And it's really tough, right? You've got to, find that first alert to sort of tell the story, doing the forensics. It's really important, right? And then when you talk about, recovery in the environment, you got to test the recovery process. Are your backups not only isolated, but do they have, what's it called? If they did access them, do you have snapshots, right? The immutability of history snapshots you can go back to that couldn't ever be messed with, because that's a big problem if it is, right? It's huge stuff, right? And for a manufacturer, not just doing backups, you got to validate production, quality assurance, inventorying, warehouse distribution. I mean, this moves downstream for absolutely everything. So for manufacturers, that's actually why manufacturing in our threat report, the 2026, Open Text Cybersecurity Threat Report, manufacturing was clearly targeted, like almost 40% more than the average, because of the impact that it has in manufacturing. You think about downstream, it's huge. And so this is why they're targeted, because a lot of the times, on average, they pay the ransom more because of the impact, right? And so it's a real big problem.
Finally then, Tyler, apart from, I guess, making sure you have your own cow in the backyard, what is the one thing that listeners should be remembering from this incident?
Yeah, the target of ransomware isn't like one server, or it's the business process that depends on the server, right? So Fairlife had facilities, employees, raw materials, retailers, customers, you name it, right? But when attackers reached production related systems, their US production stopped entirely. That's the real ransomware threat there, is that an organization can have functioning equipment and available people, but still be unable to operate because it can no longer trust the digital system and ecosystem connecting everything together, right? Cyber resilience means understanding those dependencies before an attack, containing the attacker before disruption spreads, and then being able to restore the complete business process in a clean and trusted environment. Because getting a server back online is not the same as getting, milk back on the production line and out the door.
Tyler, I'm a bit upset there, because my gag about having a cow in your backyard, I think you just totally ignored it.
I completely ignored it.
You did. Oh, there were so many other bad jokes I could have made about things going sour and crying over spilt milk.
Did you know that the milk from a cow that you have in your backyard would come out at 98 degrees Fahrenheit? I don't want hot milk. It's gross.
There we go, people. If you've learned one thing from this podcast, milk from a cow's udder comes out at 98 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're listening to Reimagining Cyber, you are always learning. Tyler, fantastic stuff, as always.
Thanks for having me on, Ben.
We'll be back, of course, next week here on Reimagining Cyber with some more cow stats, if you're lucky. In the meantime, do remember to rate, review, and share the show. Goodbye.